In the last podcast, I briefly reviewed some of the conventional geography surrounding educational discourse on diversity, particularly the shape of debate surrounding differential educational achievement. At the end of that resource, I suggested, however, that whilst this focus was crucial, it was not the only way of talking and thinking about difference. The implication here is that there are other ways of framing this discussion, and in this podcast, I intend to explicate some alternative perspectives. In no way do I wish to imply that this is anything like a finished or coherent offering. Rather, it represents an attempt to provoke a different form of discussion on diversity. The impulse to critically refrain from conventional discourse needs some form of motivation. And for me, this rationale comes from a sense that left uninterrogated, there's a risk that positive intentions can harbour unintended consequences. In short, that a discourse of diversity can accidentally reproduce the processes it intends to address. Thus, from one perspective, we might suggest that one unintended outcome of the differential educational achievement turn is a tendency towards a partial attention to the complexities of diversity. To frame this in a more concrete manner, for me, the dominant discourse on diversity is problematic on 3 counts. Firstly, an assumption of deficit tends to inhabit these ways of talking about difference, a sense that diversity presents challenges and problems. The very nature of the differential achievement agenda, of course, pivots on this. The second problem stems from an overfocus on achievement, which brings with it a utilitarian sense to the discussion. Here, diversity is framed in terms of performative outcomes, part of the broader tyranny of measurability which inhabits education. Both of these two facets are problematic because they are reductive, diminishing the significance of what might be important aspects of any given individual, and casting those facets as negative. The third problem arises from the conjunction of the first two. Where a discourse of difference is tied to differential achievement, we tend only to consider those diversities which surface on that particular landscape. If a facet of difference does not present itself within that geography, then it tends to be delegitimised as a valid concern. In short then, I feel that the issue here is that taken on its own, a focus only on diversity in relation to achievement blinkers our vision to the true complexities of difference in the classroom. It blinds us firstly to the range of diversities present in any given educational context, at least in official mandate, and secondly to the complexities and significances of diversity within the groups that are on the formal agenda. I would suggest that one way of reframing the issue in light of this tension is to consider diversity through a different lens, that of human rights. Such a stance implicates that we focus not on deficits and problems, the ways in which diversities prevent children from occupying preferred performative outcomes, but on the right and entitlement of every individual to be valued as unique and valid. Such a call shifts some of the pressure from the need for the individual to change in order to occupy institutional preferences, and instead to the institution to accommodate them more effectively. This kind of thinking makes me consider how teachers and schools orient their practice towards difference and diversity. We might draw a crude distinction between 3 forms of approach, what I call the blind, deficit and asset approaches, which in turn ignore, problematise and celebrate diversity. This is not to say that we can necessarily characterise schools or teachers as occupying one of these stances. Rather, they tend to draw on a mishmash of approaches. Similarly, we shouldn't assume that one is better than any other. Each has its own tensions and contradictions. Blind approaches, for instance, work on an assumption that we should not draw attention to difference, to begin from a starting point which recognises similarity and belonging rather than otherness. Equally though, these good intentions can accidentally overlook genuine needs, or can signal to learners that a segment of their sense of self is not important in education. At the other extreme, the asset model suffers from the converse tension. It actively celebrates senses of self, but possibly at the risk of othering individuals and marking them out as different. This reframing also makes me think about whether all forms of diversity are equal in terms of the discourse surrounding education, whether each is sanctioned as legitimate as part of thinking, practice and provision. It seems to me that some, class, gender, ethnicity for instance, are very much on the agenda, sanctioned as the responsibility of teachers by dominant discourse. Others are a little more marginalised, and others still actively stigmatised. Whilst I'm sure that few teachers would be as crude as to suggest that a learner's sexuality is insignificant, as a form of diversity, sexuality is less legitimised as a point of concern in discourses. Indeed, until very recently, issues around sexuality were actively stigmatised through policy. Mental health also forms a facet of diversity less sanctioned in consideration and talk. In turn, these directions of thought make me wonder about the school as an arena through which different diversities are sanctioned and stigmatised, and by extension through the way policy and momentum shape discourse, and the implications that this might have for the identities of learners and their perceptions of education, their place in society, and of themselves. A number of theoretical perspectives might be useful as starting points through which to think about this issue further. Perhaps most notably, the sociologist Irving Goffman has produced significant work on the nature of stigma, the ways in which societies draw lines around individuals within them as others, and consequently prevent full participation. The origins of stigma are varied, though always socially constructed, and part of Goffman's work is an exploration of this. Elsewhere, he considers the outcomes of stigma, and the notion that the social positioning around a stigmatised characteristic forces the individual into a response. This might be an attempt to downplay or hide that characteristic, as might be the case with sexuality, to actively resist the society and institution which enforces the stigma. Here I'm reminded of work on the efforts of black boys to escape the dangerous label, or to accept the stigma and the implications it brings. For instance, that special educational needs requires remedial education. The significance of Goffman, I think, is in a reminder that there are identity politics going on here, through which learners must negotiate a broader social structure in education in relation to their senses of self. A similar politicised treatment of difference is offered by Foucault in the notion of biopower. He uses this term to describe the technologies and processes by which societies try to manage human being. For me, governmentally constituted constructs such as 5 a day in relation to diet act as useful illustrations and ways into this notion. For Foucault, notions of disability, sexuality and madness were central concerns, and his exploration focused on the ways in which social institutions attempted to police these facets of difference. Foucault's work plots historical shifts around major institutions, which attempted to govern the individual. In his study of madness, for instance, he shows shifting societal attitudes tied to dominance of various institutions, from religious treatments which viewed such differences as the work of either God or the devil, through a legalistic turn which swept undesirables from the streets and into workhouses, and finally the medical turn, which cast madness in the context of illness and treatment. Fundamental in all of this work, though, is a sense of the individual being caught up in epistemological battles, by which different social institutions try to govern and police their very being, not just in terms of their personality and behaviour, but their biology and impulses. A question hangs here over whether, as a social institution, education is also involved in this. Extending this line of discussion, Lang's notion of medical and social models of disability is useful. Put briefly, Lang's intent is to make us think about the traditional way of seeing disability as something located inside the individual, a set of problems and incapacities which prevent them from fully accessing society and social life. He suggests we might also consider the ways in which society disables the individual by being inaccessible, either in our physical provisions or in our attitudes. As such, a social model would suggest that a wheelchair user is not disabled. Rather, they are disabled by the broader environment which is not friendly to their needs. Lang extends this to work with schizophrenics, who he suggests are disabled by societal attitudes to deviation beyond a tightly defined range of accessible behaviours. Lang's work comes to life when we consider the way social attitudes around difference shifts. 50 years ago, for instance, homosexuality was governed by a legalistic discourse, which defined it as a deviant act which required incarceration. In turn, the medical profession attempted to cure homosexuality through chemical and shock therapies. Now, of course, these reactions feel brutal. And this reflects the sense of both Foucault and Lang. Firstly, the notion of different institutions, law and medicine, battling to regulate a particular part of human being. Secondly, the sense that societies, through the stigmas they attach to individuals, actively disable them. I'm always reminded here of the more mundane, at least on the surface, example of left-handedness in education. Convention here was always to treat this as a special need, and to educate the individual into using their right hand. As times and attitudes have shifted, this medical orientation has also shifted towards a more social model, which sees as common sense the view that we simply need to make reasonable adjustments to allow left-handed pupils to access education. All of this type of thinking has provoked various grassroots reactions from representatives of various diverse communities, whether in the form of queer theory, radical psychiatry, disability rights campaigns, feminist movements, and so on. They share a common orientation towards a view that if education, and we as educators, fail to interrogate and challenge normative biases around difference, we actively reinscribe them. They have thus informed a movement in critical pedagogy which actively sets out to do just that. Our task for the moment, though, is simply to reconsider these provocations, and I'd ask you in this session to think about the ways in which it might be useful to think about diversity and to think about it in diverse ways.